Hi viewers, welcome back to Silent Case, the place where the past whispers its secrets and forgotten stories finally get their voice. In this episode of Silent Case, we dig into shadows, unearth hidden truths, and follow the faint echoes of mysteries left unsolved for decades. Today's episode takes us back to 1932, to a quiet orchard where three cousins vanished without a trace. No ransom. No bodies, only secrets buried beneath the soil and letters left unopened for nearly a century. Join us as we follow the trail of hidden evidence, redacted names, and a photograph that has haunted generations. Let's step into the Harrow orchard and uncover what the ground has been keeping silent for 93 years. On a warm July afternoon in 1932, the Harrow farmhouse sat beneath a ceiling of slow-moving clouds, the kind that promised rain but never delivered it. The air smelled of cut grass, dust, and the faint sweetness of peach pies cooling on the windowsill. It was the kind of day meant for celebration, not tragedy. And yet, decades later, everyone who had lived through it would describe the same feeling, a strange stillness in the air, like something waiting to happen. It was Evelyn Harrow's 11th birthday, and her cousins Ruth and Thomas had arrived early, carrying a handmade card and a bundle of wildflowers tied with a crooked ribbon. The children spent the morning running barefoot through the yard, their laughter ricocheting between the barn and the orchard. Family members watched from folding chairs, sipping lemonade, remarking on how close the cousins were, the three inseparables, as their grandmother always called them. Witnesses would later say there was nothing unusual about the day. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, no arguments. Just a simple gathering of two families trying to forget the hardships of the Great Depression, even if just for an afternoon. The adults busied themselves with preparations while the children played hide and seek near the orchard's edge, where the trees grew dense and the shadows stretched long. The last confirmed sighting came at 3:47 p.m. A neighbor, Mrs. Alcott, saw them near the old fence line, Evelyn in her pale blue dress, Ruth carrying a red balloon, Thomas dragging a stick along the dirt path. She waved, and they waved back. Nothing about the moment suggested a goodbye. Minutes later, the children were simply gone. When their absence was first noticed, no one panicked. Children wondered, that was normal. Someone joked that they were probably stealing early slices of cake from the kitchen. But when their names were called and no small feet came running, the laughter faded. Families split into groups, searching the barn, the shed, the chicken coop. The orchard was combed twice, the creek behind the house 3 times. Their voices echoed into the woods, calling the three cousins by name, expecting an answer that never came. What investigators would later describe as the first anomaly occurred when a torn ribbon, Evelyn's, was found snagged on a low branch. The ribbon fluttered faintly in the breeze, a quiet witness to something no one had seen. Nearby, faint footprints were discovered, but they disappeared into the hardened dirt near the orchard's far end. As the sun dipped lower, the birthday festivities dissolved into chaos. The mothers cried openly, collapsing into one another as neighbors tried to console them. Fathers and uncles formed search lines, lanterns swinging in trembling hands. A few men rode horses past the property line, toward the woods, shouting into the dusk. Dogs were brought in from nearby farms, but kept losing the scent at the same place, the abandoned grain shed that had stood untouched for nearly a decade. By nightfall, fear replaced confusion. Cars from nearby towns began lining the dirt road, their headlights casting long streaks across the fields. Dozens of volunteers joined the search, their boots crunching through grass wet with dew. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every rustle of leaves made someone turn. At 2 a.m., the sheriff ordered the first official statement. 3 local children are missing. Search efforts are ongoing. What he didn't mention, even then, were the early contradictions. A farmer claimed he heard a wagon passing around the time the children disappeared, though no one else had seen one. A young deputy swore he found drag marks near the orchard, but was later told to stop imagining things. And a teenage cousin recalled hearing a man's voice near the fence line that afternoon, a detail investigators would ignore for decades. By sunrise, the once bright birthday decorations hung limp from the porch, soaked in dew. The cake sat untouched on the kitchen table, candles still standing, as if waiting for 3 children who were never coming back. The families refused to leave, sitting shoulder to shoulder on the porch steps, staring into the orchard with blank, exhausted eyes. The tragedy of that day would haunt the Harrow and Mayfield families for generations. The official file opened that morning, Case 17 would become one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in state history. And though no one knew it yet, the silence that began on that birthday would stretch across nearly a century. But the first night ended with one chilling detail. At exactly 4:19 a.m., a volunteer searching near the orchard claimed he heard children's laughter drifting through the trees. He followed the sound. Nothing was there. Dawn had barely settled over the Harrow property when the second wave of searchers arrived. Men carrying lanterns, women holding blankets, and deputies with rifles slung over their shoulders. The traces of night searches still littered the ground: trampled grass, discarded water jugs, and a single lantern lying on its side where someone had dropped it during a false alarm. The orchard, once the children's favorite place to play, now looked hostile, branches tangled like reaching arms, shadows clinging to every space the light couldn't touch. Sheriff Dalton, a man worn by years of small town disputes and farm accidents, stood at the orchard's edge studying the ground as if it might speak. He had already been told about the volunteer who claimed to hear laughter at 4:19 a.m. The sheriff dismissed it as exhaustion or nerves, but the mothers didn't. They clung to the story as if it proved the children were still close, still alive. Search dogs were brought in shortly after sunrise. 2 hounds from a nearby town, trained mostly for hunting but capable enough for tracking. At first, the dogs caught a scent quickly, pulling their handlers toward the eastern side of the orchard. Their barks cut through the morning fog, raising brief hope among the families. Evelyn's mother whispered a prayer. Thomas's father tightened his grip on his lantern, but the trail stopped abruptly at a patch of hardened earth behind a decaying grain shed. The dogs circled, sniffed, whimpered, and then sat down, confused, unwilling to move forward. One handler muttered, "Scent breaks here," like they vanished into the ground. A few feet away, Deputy Langley knelt beside something half buried beneath leaves. He held it up with shaking fingers, a small wooden stick with a carving on one end. Thomas had been whittling that same stick earlier that morning. His father recognized it instantly. "That's his he said, voice cracking. Hope rose again, but so did dread. Searchers spread outward from the shed, combing the trees in tight rows. The orchard's soil was soft in some places and packed in others, making footprints difficult to track. A few faint impressions appeared near the shed, but they overlapped with dozens of adult boots from the frantic overnight search. Then came the first contradiction. A neighbor named Ray Lockwood swore he heard wheels. Wagon wheels around the time the children went missing, rolled across the dirt road fast, he said. Didn't sound like any of our folks. But others insisted no wagon had passed their homes. The sheriff wrote the testimony down, though later investigators would learn the note was moved to a separate folder and never reappeared in the official record. Around noon, as the heat settled in and tempers flared, 2 men found what they believed were drag marks in the dirt leading away from the orchard. They called for the sheriff, but by the time he arrived, the marks were muddled by the crowd gathering around them. Dalton reprimanded the men for jumping to conclusions and ordered everyone to step back. Yet one detail couldn't be ignored. Pinned against the shed's rotting wall, flattened by time and boot prints, was a small scrap of fabric. Light blue, torn at the edge. Evelyn's dress had been blue. The mother's collapsed again, held up by relatives, while deputies taped the area with rough twine 1932's version of a crime scene perimeter. Day faded into evening without new leads. Rumors spread, fear grew, and every path, every clue, seemed to point toward the orchard, and then dissolve into nothing. By the time the sun set, Sheriff Dalton silently admitted what no one wanted to believe. This was no simple disappearance. By the third day, hope had thinned into something brittle, present only because the families refused to let it die. The orchard had been searched so many times that even the deputies admitted they no longer knew what was disturbed by the missing children and what was ruined by frantic boots. The grain shed, the creek, the fence line, every corner of the Harrow property bore the marks of desperation, but desperation wasn't enough for Sheriff Dalton. What he needed were leads, and none were holding. The drag marks from the day before were dismissed after more searching produced no continuation. The dogs failed repeatedly to pick up a trail. The torn ribbon, the carved stick, the blue scrap of fabric, all labeled inconclusive. Witnesses contradicted each other. And the wagon described by Ray Lockwood never appeared again in testimony. 2 neighbors insisted he'd been drinking that afternoon. Small-town politics crept in early. Rumors circulated that the sheriff's office was embarrassing the county, and that outsiders, state investigators, even federal agents, might show up if the search didn't end soon. Dalton didn't want that. Neither did the mayor. The country was already struggling through the Great Depression. Panic was unwelcome. By the end of the first week, with no fresh evidence and rising pressure from county officials, the tone of the investigation shifted from urgent searching to quiet retreat. Deputy Langley kept pushing. He drafted a report highlighting suspicious inconsistencies. The wagon tracks never followed up the muffled voice heard near the fence, the drag marks that vanished the children's laughter, reported at 4:19 a.m. But when Langley handed the report to Dalton, it returned the next morning missing 2 pages. Langley confronted the sheriff, who replied only, "You're young. Don't make this your burden. Families need closure, not wild theories." Closure came brutally early. On the 10th day, the sheriff held a brief meeting in the town hall. Only 9 people attended. He announced that, in the absence of evidence, the disappearance of the 3 cousins would be classified as a probable runaway case. The mothers protested until their voices broke, insisting their children would never run away. Not on a birthday, not together, not without a word. But Dalton had made up his mind, or had it made up for him. A single paragraph was drafted to conclude the investigation. No signs of foul play. Likely voluntary departure by minors. Case closed pending new evidence. The families refused to sign the paperwork acknowledging the decision. It didn't matter. The county approved it anyway. Within weeks, the initial search reports were boxed. Evidence, if it could be called that, was stored in a drawer. Statements were filed away. The torn ribbon was sent home with Evelyn's mother as a comfort. An act that felt more like surrender than compassion. Newspapers ran one more headline: 3 cousins gone, authorities halt investigation. And then silence. The Harrow orchard, once the center of frantic searches, returned to its quiet stillness. Grass regrew over footprints, the grain shed sagged further into decay. The laughter that had once filled the yard felt like a memory someone else had lived. Privately, some deputies admitted they felt something was wrong, something unfinished. One recalled seeing a different set of tracks behind the shed, larger than a child's, but chose not to mention it after the case closure. Another confessed decades later that they had orders from higher offices to stop escalating the matter. For the families, the emotional fallout was immediate and lifelong. Evelyn's mother kept her daughter's dress laid across her bed for years. Ruth's father left town for a decade, unable to walk past the orchard. Thomas's older brother became obsessed with the case, starting notebooks filled with sketches and theories. Time moved forward, but grief remained anchored in 1932. Case file no. 17. Sat in storage, untouched, collecting dust and mold. Sealed not by truth, but by exhaustion and fear. For more than 3 decades, case file No. 17 lay buried in the county archives, resting between tax ledgers and water permits, its edges yellowing, its pages curling with humidity and neglect, the families fractured and faded. Some moved away, others stayed, but spoke of the incident only in hushed tones, as if naming the children aloud might reopen old wounds. And for a long time the orchard behind the Harrow house remained untouched, the grain shed rotting deeper into the soil like a grave. Then, in the summer of 1964, the silence was interrupted. The Harrow farmhouse sold to the Beaumont family, newcomers from Louisiana searching for a quieter life. They had no connection to the tragedy. They didn't even know the land carried a history. All they saw was a modest home on a stretch of green fields and an orchard that promised sweet fruit in the fall. But the land remembered. On their second week in the house, Mrs. Beaumont began hearing laughter, children's laughter near the orchard just past sunset. At first she brushed it off as neighborhood kids playing, but the nearest neighbor lived half a mile away, and the laughter always came from the same place, the far edge of the orchard, near the decaying shed. One evening she followed the sound, walking slowly between the trees, her flashlight beam dancing across branches and fallen fruit. The laughter stopped abruptly as she approached, replaced by the rustle of wind moving through the leaves. She found nothing but an overwhelming stillness, the same stillness the Harrows had described in 1932. She didn't mention it to her husband until the second incident. After a heavy storm, the orchard floor was littered with broken branches and muddy patches. While clearing debris, Mrs. Beaumont spotted something half buried near a peach tree, the glint of metal catching morning light. She knelt and brushed away the dirt, revealing a small rusted hairpin with a delicate floral engraving. It was old, very old. She didn't know its significance, but when she showed it to a neighbor 2 days later, the woman blanched. "That looks like one of Evelyn Harrow's," she whispered, "the little girl who disappeared here." That night, the Beaumonts learned the story of the 3 missing cousins. Disturbed, they contacted the sheriff's office. A deputy arrived, took brief notes, and placed the hairpin in a small evidence bag. He promised to pass it along, though no follow-up ever came. Years later, when records from the 1964 recheck were reviewed, the hairpin's entry appeared in a handwritten appendix, never formally added to case file No. 17A. But the orchard wasn't finished giving up its secrets. Late that same year, while repairing part of the fence line, Mr. Beaumont unearthed a set of small stones arranged in a pattern, 3 placed close together, 1 slightly apart. At first he thought they were the remains of a child's game, but the older neighbors grew uneasy when they saw them. Those weren't there in the 40s, one said quietly, another muttered, "Leave the past alone." A brief reinvestigation was launched, more for public reassurance than truth-seeking. Deputies walked the orchard again, poking at soil with metal rods, circling the old shed with wary glances. No new evidence was officially logged. The case was relabeled inactive. Once again, 17 sank back into silence. But not completely. The Beaumonts eventually moved away, shaken by the atmosphere of the land. The orchard grew dense again, and the hair, Evelyn's hairpin, remained boxed in a county drawer, forgotten beneath minor burglary reports. Time pressed forward, but the case refused to stay buried. The drive back from the archives felt heavier than expected, as if the car itself carried the weight of everything revealed in Chapter 4. Detective Aram Qureshi replayed the librarian's trembling voice, the hushed whispers about strange visitors, and the haunting note scribbled in the margins of the old registry. Every piece of the past felt unfinished, interrupted, like someone had deliberately closed the book before truth had a chance to speak. By the time Aram reached the victim's old residence, dusk had already swallowed the street. turning the familiar house into a silent witness waiting to be confronted. The front door, long sealed and layered with dust, groaned open. Aram stepped inside, disturbed by how unchanged everything felt. Furniture remained covered under sheets, framed photos hung crooked, and the faint smell of aging paper drifted through the air. It was as if the house had been holding its breath for decades. Crime scene technicians followed behind him, their lights slicing through the dim interior. Aram moved toward the study, the room repeatedly mentioned in early statements but never thoroughly searched after the case went cold. He ran his fingers along the desk, stopping when he noticed a drawer slightly misaligned. A quiet instinct tugged at him. He pulled it open, revealing a stack of envelopes tied together with a crumbling thread. The ink on the top one was faint, but still readable, to be opened only if something happens. He froze. These letters had never appeared in the original evidence logs. Someone had either overlooked them or avoided them. He untied the brittle thread carefully, feeling the tension of something long hidden finally resurfacing. Each envelope bore a different date, spanning the final 6 months before the disappearance. But every single one shared one chilling detail. The seal remained unbroken. Not one had been opened. "Get gloves," Aram murmured. The team gathered, watching as he lifted the first envelope. The handwriting inside was shaky, each word pressed deep into the paper as if written in panic. "I keep hearing footsteps at night. They stop outside my door. I know someone is inside the house, watching. I'm not imagining it anymore." Aram exhaled slowly. The fear was palpable. The second letter painted a darker picture. The writer described items moving, doors unlocking on their own, and a shadow lingering behind the curtain at precisely the same time each night. The letter ended abruptly with a line underlined twice. "I think he found the attic key." A cold ripple ran through the room. The attic had been searched, but nothing substantial was found, at least not according to the initial reports. Aram opened the third envelope, his jaw tightening as he read the words, "If anything happens to me, look for the person who keeps asking about the children. He knows things he shouldn't." The date stamped on the letter was exactly 9 days before the disappearance. Aram's stomach twisted. Why had this never surfaced? Why had no officer acted on these warnings? The fourth envelope felt heavier, as though something inside shifted. When he opened it, a small, folded photograph slid out. It was blurry, taken from a low angle through what looked like a window. The image showed the missing children standing outside the house, but their expressions were tense, almost fearful. The timestamp was shocking, taken 1 day before they vanished, at an hour when they were supposedly at a neighbor's home. Someone had been watching them, someone close. Aram studied the background of the photo, noticing a faint silhouette reflected in the glass. The angle suggested the picture was taken from inside the house, not outside. That meant the photographer wasn't an intruder. It was someone who already had access. Before he could process the implications, a technician approached with another discovery. Hidden beneath the drawer's false bottom was a fifth envelope, smaller, sealed, and marked with only one word, "Stop." Inside was a torn piece of lined paper containing half a sentence, written in frantic strokes. "Not safe anymore," he said the children. The message ended there. Aram's pulse thudded in his ears. If the writer was interrupted before finishing this note, then whatever happened next wasn't accidental. He looked at his team, voice low but firm. These letters changed the entire trajectory of the case. As they began packing the evidence, Aram felt the weight of the impending truth. He knew the unopened mail didn't just reveal fear, it pointed directly toward a hidden threat the original investigation had missed entirely. And when these letters reached the 2025 task force, everything was about to ignite again. Detective Aram Qureshi sat alone in the dimly lit conference room of the missing persons unit, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. The documents from Chapter 5, the stack of unopened letters discovered in the victim's abandoned home, rested on the table before him. Their yellowed envelopes, brittle from age, felt like time capsules from a past no one had dared to touch. Now, in early 2025, every instinct in RM insisted that whatever hid inside those letters was going to shake the entire investigation, and it did. RM straightened as the task force entered the room. Digital analysts, forensic archivists, and investigators trained specifically for cold case reconstruction. This wasn't just another meeting. It was the official reopening of a case that had slept for decades. The board behind him displayed the familiar faces, the missing siblings, the devastated parents, the lone survivor whose testimony had never fully aligned with the evidence. Now, with the letters and new technology on their side, RM felt as though the investigation was breathing again. He opened the first letter. Inside was a brief note, handwritten and trembling. "He's watching again. I know you won't believe me, but something is wrong in this house." The date matched a week before the disappearance. Gasps broke out across the room. A forensic analyst leaned forward, noting that the ink pattern suggested the writer had been in distress, likely trembling, possibly crying. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a warning that had gone unanswered. The second letter was even more disturbing. The message described shadows moving in the hallway at night, items shifting places, and footsteps that followed the writer from room to room. The team exchanged uneasy glances. Was it a stalker, a neighbor, someone who had key access to the property? Or was it something else entirely, something psychological, something darker? RM didn't rule out anything, but it was the third letter that changed everything. This one mentioned a name, partially smudged, barely legible, but undeniably present. The same name had appeared briefly in an old police report from 1998, mentioned by a witness who later recanted under mysterious circumstances. Now it resurfaced like a ghost clawing back into relevance. RM felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't coincidence. This was the thread they had missed. Over the next few hours, the room transformed into a controlled storm of activity. Analysts scanned the handwriting, cross-referenced signatures, and digitally reconstructed, smudged parts of the text. One breakthrough followed another. A digital reconstruction revealed what the erased name almost certainly was a person of interest who had lived just 3 streets away from the victims. Someone with a criminal record that had been sealed. Someone who had disappeared just days after the children did. A cold silence settled over the room as everyone processed the implications. RM leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If he vanished right after the kids, then either he ran because he knew something, he said quietly, or because he was involved. The team nodded, but there was something else bothering RM, something he couldn't quite articulate. He picked up the 4th letter, the final one found in the drawer. This envelope was never opened, even by the original homeowner. When he sliced it open, a small photograph slipped out. It was grainy, off-center, but unmistakable, a picture of the missing children standing outside their house. Yet the timestamp showed it had been taken just 1 day before they vanished, at a time when, according to every known statement, they were supposed to be somewhere else entirely. The room froze. Someone had lied. Someone had altered the timeline. Someone had been watching those children far more closely than anyone realized. RM felt a chill crawl down his back. This wasn't random, he murmured. They were being monitored. Just then, the lead forensic archivist approached with fresh results. The letters, she explained, hadn't just been written in fear. They had been written while the victim was under surveillance from inside the house. Hidden indentations on the paper indicated another sheet beneath it, containing scribbles and a partial sketch. When digitally enhanced, the sketch revealed a face, not fully detailed, but clear enough to match against known profiles. RM stared at the emerging lines on the screen, his breath shallow. If the match came back positive, it would flip the entire case on its head. "Run it through the database," he ordered. The analyst nodded and clicked the command. A spinning wheel appeared on the monitor, the entire room holding its breath. Aram stepped back, staring at the faces on the investigation board. "If this comes back with a hit," he whispered, "then everything we thought we knew about the disappearance is wrong." The loading bar reached 90%, and then the screen blinked. Match found. Aram's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He didn't recognize the name, but he recognized the address attached to it. It belonged to someone still alive, and someone who had never been questioned. The next morning, Detective Aram Qureshi returned to the archives with a sense of cautious anticipation. After the 2025 reopening, Case File 17 had become more than a cold case. It had transformed into a labyrinth of secrets hidden in plain sight. He wasn't the first to notice them. The unopened letters from Chapter 5 had already set off alarms, and now he had to trace every name, every lead, every redacted page that had been intentionally concealed for decades. The first task was the original police files. Aram sat at a long oak table, surrounded by stacks of yellowed folders. Some names were blacked out so completely that it looked as if someone had intended them to vanish from memory forever. Others were partially obscured, with only a few letters legible. One name kept catching his eye, R.T.H. He noted it carefully in his journal. It matched none of the immediate family or neighbors, yet appeared in multiple witness statements, often dismissed in the original 1932 investigation. He called in a retired deputy, Elias Monroe, who had worked on the case as a young man. Monroe's hands shook slightly as he sifted through the same pages Aram had been studying. "I remember this name," he whispered. "We were told we weren't supposed to follow up. Harrow said it wasn't relevant." He paused, glancing at the faded typewriter ink, still fresh enough to read decades later. "I don't know why we did what we were told, but we ignored it." Aram leaned closer. "Do you remember anything about this person?" Monroe swallowed. "Not much. Just that he had access to the property, knew the family, people trusted him too much." His voice trembled, and for a moment the weight of unspoken truths filled the room like smoke. "He disappeared shortly after the kids did. No one ever saw him again." Aram scribbled furiously in his notebook. A name that vanished, a man who had vanished, and a connection to children who vanished. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Next, Aram accessed the digitized FBI files. Nearly every page that should have contained leads, witness names, or statements of interest was either blacked out or missing entirely. One document, labeled Subject Observations, 1932, was partially readable. It described a man with a wide, brimmed hat seen near the orchard multiple times in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. The name was redacted. Referencing handwriting from the unopened letters, Aram realized the same person had been mentioned. Again, redacted. Someone at a high level had deliberately concealed the link. Aram felt a chill. This wasn't oversight. This was intentional. To uncover more, he contacted descendants of the original deputies. One grandson, hesitant at first, eventually led Aram to a small wooden box hidden in his attic. Inside were handwritten notes, partially destroyed, with names carefully erased or scratched out. Yet one note remained mostly intact. "It wasn't an accident. They were chosen. I warned them. I tried to stop it." The handwriting matched that of Deputy Langley's archived letters. The phrase, "they were chosen," echoed across decades, now resonating with newfound urgency. Further investigation revealed a series of memos, unsigned, instructing deputies not to pursue certain leads. The documents were stamped with phrases like "sensitive, do not circulate," and "priority clearance required." Aram felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Authorities had not just failed the investigation, they had actively suppressed it. A pattern began to emerge. Every redacted name, every smudged note, Every sealed envelope pointed to a hidden network, a silent, deliberate obstruction that stretched from the local sheriff's office to federal oversight. The question was no longer who had vanished that summer, but who had the power to hide them for so long. Aram leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the room filled with decades of hidden truths. Each redaction, each erased name, was a key. He could almost hear the faint echo of children's laughter behind the walls, lost in the archive but not forgotten. Somewhere in those blacked-out letters and smudged notes, the next clue waited. And then, tucked in the corner of one folder, he saw it. A partial photograph, nearly obscured by a stamp, depicting the orchard with a symbol carved into the wagon panel, one he hadn't noticed before. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just obstruction. It was a breadcrumb left deliberately, waiting for someone patient enough to follow. Aram whispered to himself, "This leads directly to them." The photograph marked the transition. The hidden names, the sealed letters, the handwritten confessions, they all converged on a tangible clue that demanded immediate attention. The next step was clear. Analyze the photograph, uncover the symbol, and trace it forward. Detective Aram Qureshi stared at the photograph spread out on the light table, its surface glowing faintly under the soft fluorescent bulbs. The edges of the image were frayed, curling from decades of mishandling, yet the details were undeniable. There in the center stood the three missing cousins, Evelyn in her pale blue dress, Ruth clutching a deflated red balloon, and Thomas dragging a small stick along the dirt path. Their expressions were cautious, almost tense, far from the carefree joy expected of a summer afternoon. But it wasn't their faces that drew Aram's attention. It was the background. Behind the children, the wooden wagon near the orchard had a symbol carved into its side, an angular, almost geometric shape that seemed too deliberate to be a child's doodle. The corners were sharp, the lines precise. A shiver ran down Aram's spine. Symbols weren't random, they were markers, messages, warnings, or something far darker. He leaned closer, adjusting the magnifying lens, noting the faint impressions left behind on the photo's paper. Someone had enhanced it decades ago, but only partially, leaving much of the detail obscure. Using new digital reconstruction software, Aram began to enhance the shadowed areas. Slowly, a man materialized in the background wearing a wide, brimmed hat and standing near the fence line. His face was indistinct, blurred by distance and the camera's poor quality, but his posture radiated intent. Not an innocent observer, someone waiting, someone watching. The evidence was chilling. Whoever had taken the photograph had captured the children at a moment they weren't supposed to be outside, and someone else, deliberately placed in the background, was monitoring them. The thought made Aram's stomach knot. Next, he cross-referenced the symbol on the wagon with archived FBI files and old county reports. His team's faces paled as connections emerged. A nearly identical symbol had been recorded in a separate 1934 child abduction case, only miles away. That case had been closed due to lack of evidence, the files archived and largely forgotten. But the symbol wasn't incidental. It was a signature, a calling card left by the same individual, or possibly the same network, responsible for targeting children in the area during that era. Aram's fingers trembled slightly as he held the photograph against the light again. Details previously hidden now stood out, faint scratches near the wagon wheels, a small object lodged at the base of the tree, a toy soldier, identical to one Thomas had been known to carry. The child's possessions were left behind, meticulously, almost ritualistically. Each detail suggested planning. Each detail suggested control. He called in a historical analyst, Dr. Layla Farouk, to interpret the symbol. She studied it with furrowed brows. "This isn't just a doodle," she murmured. "It's consistent with ritualistic markings used by small, secret societies in rural areas during the 1930s. They were obscure, very localized, and almost always connected to selective abductions." Her voice dropped. "If this symbol is authentic, Then these children weren't random victims. Aram's mind raced. The revelation explained much of the redacted names, the sealed letters, and the obstructed investigation. They weren't mistakes. They were deliberate attempts to bury a system that had operated quietly, but with precise intent. He turned to the team. "We have to map every occurrence of this symbol," he said. "Every file, every photograph, every report. If we do this systematically, we can see the full pattern, and maybe identify the individuals involved." As the analysts began cataloging evidence, Aram noticed another detail he hadn't seen before. Near the corner of the photograph, partially hidden by the faded grass, was a small object, a piece of blue fabric caught on a nail. He recognized it immediately, the same material as Evelyn's dress, torn during her last known moments outside. It was a breadcrumb left in plain sight, proof that the children had been physically present at this exact location, and that something, or someone, had interacted with them before their disappearance. The room fell silent. Every investigator understood the weight of this discovery. The photograph wasn't just a historical record. It was an active clue, a frozen moment of evidence from the day everything changed. Every line, every shadow, every scratched detail demanded interpretation, and failure to do so could let decades of injustice continue unchecked. Aram exhaled slowly. He looked back at the photograph, and for a moment, the room seemed to darken. The orchard from 1932 was alive again in that image, not with the laughter of children, but with the presence of someone who had been watching, planning, and waiting. He whispered to himself, almost reflexively, "This leads straight to them." The first beams of dawn in the Harrow orchard cut through a low, lingering mist, dusting the grass and the gnarled trees with a pale silver light. Detective Aram Qureshi stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the familiar grain shed whose decayed wood now seemed to hide more than just rot. After the revelation of the photograph in Chapter 8, the man in the background, the symbol on the wagon, and the piece of blue fabric, it was clear that the orchard had been a silent witness all along. But what no one had realized was just how literal that silence had been. Beneath the surface, something had waited for decades, buried and forgotten. Ground penetrating radar had been brought in by the forensic team overnight. The results were definitive. A rectangular anomaly appeared beneath the base of the shed, aligned perfectly with the oldest trees in the orchard. Dimensions suggested a hidden cellar or small substructure, enough space to conceal something or someone. The team moved cautiously. Every step toward the shed seemed heavier, the air thicker, as if the orchard itself was aware of their intentions. Aram knelt beside the entrance, brushing away decades of dirt, leaves, and moss. The ground beneath the shed gave way with a hollow sound. He felt the vibrations through his fingertips, the sensation almost like the orchard exhaling after years of holding its secret. "Here," he murmured to the team. "This is it. This is where everything changed." Carefully, the forensic archaeologists removed the last remnants of the collapsed wooden floorboards. Dust floated in spirals through the beams of sunlight, landing on old cobwebs, broken branches, and the cracked ground beneath. Then, at the center of the opening, a metal latch emerged, rusted but functional. Aram's gloved hand traced the outline, feeling the rough edges, the decades of neglect. When the latch was lifted, a small staircase descended into darkness. A powerful flashlight illuminated the first step. The cellar smelled of damp earth, mold, and something faintly metallic. Aram led the descent, followed by the team, each footstep echoing against stone walls that had remained undisturbed for nearly a century. At the base, the space opened into a low-ceilinged chamber. The room was cramped but meticulously organized, as if someone had intended for it to hold contents in perfect order, unseen by the outside world. The first discovery was mundane, almost domestic. 3 small chairs, chipped and faded, arranged in a triangle. One corner of the room held a tiny table with a cracked tea set, but the unsettling nature of the scene became apparent as the team explored further. Along the far wall, faint indentations in the dirt suggested the movement of small bodies. The blue scrap of fabric from Evelyn's dress was found partially buried, the same as seen in the photograph, providing undeniable confirmation that the children had been here. The team's attention shifted to a wooden chest in the corner. Dust and decay had warped the lid, but it opened with a creak that sounded unnervingly like a scream. Inside were personal items belonging to each child: Ruth's balloon deflated and brittle, Thomas's carved stick, and Evelyn's hairpin, the same one discovered in the unopened letters decades earlier. Each object was a silent testament to the lives that had been interrupted, frozen in time, hidden beneath the orchard where no one had looked. Aram's pulse quickened as he realized the significance. "This isn't just evidence," he said quietly. "This is the truth the case was hiding, all of it. The cellar confirms every detail from the photograph, the letters, the redacted names. They were brought here deliberately, observed, and left." His voice caught on the last word. A forensic specialist uncovered a narrow alcove behind the chest. Inside, faint chalk markings matched the symbol carved on the wagon in the photograph. It had been etched directly into the wall, a signature of the person responsible, preserved for decades. Aram traced the lines with a gloved fingertip. Each corner, each angle, connected to a broader pattern, a network of children targeted in that era. The room was silent except for the shuffling of boots and the careful recording of evidence. Outside, the orchard swayed gently in the morning wind, carrying the faint echo of long, forgotten laughter. But in the cellar, that echo was replaced by the weight of discovery, the gravity of a secret finally unearthed. Aram stood and exhaled slowly. The orchard had held its secret for 93 years, but now the truth could finally be confronted. "We've found them," he said, voice low and steady, "and now we have to follow the trail this leads to." The air inside the Harrow orchard carried the weight of decades. Detective Aram Qureshi paused at the base of the grain shed, staring down at the entrance to the cellar where the children's belongings had been discovered. The evidence had already painted a horrifying picture: a hidden chamber, personal items preserved for nearly a century, and symbols that linked this location to a broader network of targeted abductions. But one question remained, burning hotter than any forensic lead: who had orchestrated it all? The photograph from 1932 had haunted Aram since it resurfaced. 3 children standing cautiously in the orchard, a man in a wide brimmed hat looming in the background, a symbol carved into the wagon. Every detail pointed to a single figure, yet every lead had been buried, redacted, or ignored by authorities at the time. Now, the reopening of Case File 17 allowed Aram to connect the final dots. He entered the Harrow farmhouse once more, reviewing archival documents that had long been sealed. The old FBI files, the redacted names, the handwritten letters, all converged on a single point: a man who had been present in the neighborhood, who had access to the property, and whose movements coincided with the disappearance of the children. The name, partially obscured in the 1932 report, had been uncovered through enhanced digital reconstruction: Roland Thayer. Records indicated Thayer had been a local carpenter, a familiar face to families in the area. But beneath the veneer of trustworthiness, he had been linked to other suspicious incidents in surrounding counties, all involving children disappearing under circumstances that mirrored the Harrow case. By piecing together census data, property deeds, and employment records, Aram discovered that Thayer had moved frequently, always leaving before the attention of authorities could reach him. What made him most dangerous, however, was his familiarity with the orchard. Witness accounts, partially redacted, described him examining the lay out months before the disappearance, measuring distances between trees, and leaving marks on the wagon in a way that mirrored the symbol found in the cellar. He had studied, planned, and executed each step with chilling precision. Aram traced Thayer's movements through historical maps and archived mail. In one letter, preserved but unopened in a private collection, Thayer himself hinted at surveillance. "The children are careful, but I am patient. They will be ready when the time comes." Reading the words decades later sent a shiver down Aram's spine. It wasn't fantasy or bravado. It was documentation of intent. The breakthrough came when a local historian provided Aram with a photograph of Thayer from 1931, standing outside a neighboring barn. The wide, brimmed hat, the posture, the gaze, it matched the figure in the orchard photograph with uncanny precision. Using facial recognition software to compare the grainy images, Aram confirmed the identification. The man who had been watching the children, the one frozen in the 1932 photo, was indeed Roland Thayer. Forensic psychologists studying the case suggested that Thayer's behavior displayed calculated sociopathy. He selected his victims carefully, monitored them, and created a ritualistic environment to control their final movements. The cellar, the preserved belongings, and the symbolic carvings were not accidental. They were his method of asserting dominion over the children's lives, leaving a signature for anyone perceptive enough to notice. But there was more. Thayer had not acted alone. Cross-referencing symbols, letters, and local archives revealed a network of individuals, each performing a role in the orchestrated disappearances, who had communicated in codes and redacted names, ensuring no authority could fully trace their actions. The system had been dormant for decades, waiting only for someone persistent enough to reassemble it piece by piece. Aram felt a mixture of dread and resolve. He stared at the orchard, now illuminated by the afternoon sun. For 93 years, the trees had hidden a truth too terrible to face. Now, with the identification of Thayer, the photograph, the cellar, and the recovered artifacts, the final layer of silence could finally be pierced. He whispered almost to himself, "You were there, and now everyone knows who you were." The investigation had reached the threshold of closure, but the full truth, the stories of the children, the network of complicity, and the final confirmation of what happened, would emerge only through painstaking forensic, psychological, and historical work. The world waited quietly on a Tuesday morning in November 2025, but inside the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., the air was tense, electric with anticipation. After months of painstaking investigation, archival research, and forensic analysis, the Harrow case, long dormant since 1932, had reached its decisive moment. Detective Aram Qureshi stood behind the curtain in a press briefing room, reviewing notes for the final announcement. The photograph, the unopened letters, the cellar evidence, and the identification of Roland Thayer had all culminated in this moment. The weight of decades of silence pressed down on him, heavier than any evidence ever could. By 10 a.m., reporters crowded the room, cameras flashing and microphones poised. The audience leaned forward as the FBI spokesperson, a composed woman named Special Agent Laura Benton, approached the podium. She cleared her throat, her voice calm but firm. "Good morning," she began. "Today we are addressing a case that has haunted this nation for over 90 years. The disappearance of 3 children from a birthday party in 1932. Gasps swept through the room. The story had been largely forgotten by the public, reduced to whispers in historical texts and true crime discussions. But the FBI had chosen this moment to reveal what modern investigation had uncovered: decades of obstruction, hidden evidence, and the deliberate concealment of a dangerous individual who had orchestrated these disappearances. Agent Benton held up a photograph, Evelyn, Ruth, and Thomas standing in the orchard, the wagon in the background. The wide, brimmed hat of Roland Thayer was faintly visible behind the trees. Through meticulous review of archival materials, forensic analysis, and new technology, She explained, "We have confirmed the identity of the man responsible for monitoring these children before their disappearance, Roland Thayer, a local resident with access to the property. Our investigations indicate that Thayer acted in concert with others who remain under investigation, forming a network responsible for a series of targeted abductions during that era." The room fell silent. Even seasoned journalists seemed stunned by the revelation. Aram stepped forward, pointing toward the slide showing the orchard cellar. "The items recovered from the cellar," he said, including personal belongings of the children and symbolic carvings on the wagon and in the hidden chamber, confirmed that the children were held in a controlled environment before they vanished. The evidence corroborates decades, old letters, eyewitness accounts, and the photographs that have resurfaced after nearly a century. One reporter raised a hand. "Agent Benton, are you saying that the children were alive in that cellar until recently?" "No," Benton replied gravely. "Unfortunately, the children were never recovered alive. The purpose of the FBI current disclosure is not to announce their survival, but to finally close the investigative gaps and reveal the truth, that this was not a random disappearance, and that authorities at the time were obstructed from acting by individuals with influence." Aram felt the tension in the room thrum against his chest. This announcement, though factual, carried a weight far heavier than he had anticipated. Families long dead, neighbors long gone, and decades of unacknowledged trauma were finally being acknowledged. The truth was no longer buried. Agent Benton continued, unveiling the recovered artifacts: Evelyn's hairpin, Thomas's carved stick, Ruth's balloon, and the letters that had never been opened. Each item was cataloged, documented, and preserved. "These items," she explained, "serve as irrefutable evidence of the events that occurred in the Harrow orchard, and they are now under the permanent custody of the FBI for historical and investigative purposes." Aram noticed the flicker in the reporter's eyes as the photograph of the wagon's symbol appeared on the screen. "We are working diligently to identify all individuals associated with this network, both living and deceased, to ensure full accountability and historical accuracy," Benton concluded. "The nation deserves closure, and the children deserve to be remembered, their story told fully and truthfully." As the press conference ended, cameras clicking and microphones retracting, Aram remained behind, staring at the orchard photograph projected on the wall. The children's eyes, frozen in that single moment from 1932, seemed to pierce through the decades. For the first time in 93 years, the case felt alive, not with fear, but with resolution. Yet the story was far from complete. There were living witnesses to interview, redacted names still to investigate, and the network that had orchestrated these abductions to trace to its final threads. The orchard lay in near-perfect stillness, the gnarled trees casting elongated shadows as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. Detective Aram Qureshi walked slowly along the familiar path, the leaves crunching softly beneath his boots. 93 years had passed since that fateful summer when Evelyn, Ruth, and Thomas had vanished, and yet the air still carried the weight of their absence. The once vibrant orchard had become a ghost of itself, the sunlight illuminating the secrets it had held for nearly a century. The FBI announcement in 2025 had brought a measure of closure to the public, yet the orchard's silence still resonated with unanswered questions. Aram paused near the base of the oldest peach tree, running his fingers along its bark. He could almost feel the echo of children's laughter lingering faintly in the air, a memory suspended in time. Each step reminded him of the cellar discovered months earlier, of the photograph that had revealed the man in the hat, and of the letters that had never been opened. Every artifact had told part of the story, but the orchard itself had witnessed everything. Aram crouched beside a patch of disturbed soil near the wagon and noticed faint impressions that the soil had preserved remarkably well. His heart quickened. The imprints were not recent. They belonged to tiny feet, perfectly captured in the earth, as if the children had walked here one last time before vanishing. He took photographs, careful to preserve the scene, but the weight of history pressed down on him. This was not just evidence. It was a portal to a moment frozen in fear, hope, and innocence abruptly stolen. The forensic team arrived shortly after, carefully analyzing the surrounding soil and vegetation. Ground, penetrating radar scans confirmed a series of small depressions around the orchard perimeter, corresponding with historical accounts of where the children had been observed moments before they disappeared. The spatial mapping reinforced a chilling reality. The children had been guided into the cellar with deliberate intent, each step orchestrated to ensure no one could follow, no one could intervene. Aram's eyes were drawn to the wagon again. The symbol carved into the wood, long since documented, seemed almost alive in the fading sunlight. He crouched and traced the grooves gently with his gloved fingers. Every line, every angle, carried intent, a signature left by the person responsible for the disappearances. It was both a clue and a confession, etched into the orchard itself. He realized that even after decades, the orchard had not relinquished its secret lightly. Nearby, Doctor. Layla Farouk knelt beside a faint indentation at the edge of the orchard, a toy soldier identical to one Thomas had carried, partially preserved in the earth. She held it up, her eyes reflecting the weight of discovery. "This," she whispered, "connects the artifact, the photograph, and the cellar. It's proof that the children's presence here wasn't incidental. Every detail was orchestrated." Aram nodded solemnly. "The orchard holds the story better than any record ever could." As the sun dipped further, casting long, skeletal shadows, Aram felt a stirring in the air, a quiet echo of the past. It was not supernatural, but rather the resonance of memory, of time preserved in soil, wood, and stone. The orchard was a witness, and its testimony had finally been heard. Families could grieve with clarity, historians could document the truth, and the nation could acknowledge the harrowing reality that had been hidden for so long. Yet even in this resolution, there was an undeniable tension. The network responsible, partially identified through archival research and forensic reconstruction, remained only partially exposed. Investigators were now following leads from surviving descendants, corroborating confessions, and cross-referencing archival patterns. The echoes of complicity, greed, and silence persisted beyond the orchard, stretching into corners of history that had never been fully illuminated. Aram stood in the clearing, watching as forensic lights illuminated the cellar entrance one last time. He exhaled slowly. "We've found the truth," he murmured, voice barely audible, "and it has finally surfaced, even if it came too late for them." The orchard seemed to respond with quietude, as if acknowledging the long-awaited justice. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the children's laughter. It was a memory, yes, but also a reminder, a truth that could never be buried again. Aram took one last look at the orchard, knowing that the case, while officially closed, would live on in the records, the artifacts, and the hearts of those who had sought justice. The echo of 1932 would never fade, but now it resonated with understanding, acknowledgement, and closure.